welcome back to the Zer0 Books archive. This is Adam from Acid Horizon, and today we're going back into the archives, not to look at any particular work, but to focus on one of the most important forebears of Zer0 Books. Today we're looking at the legacy of Semiotext, an imprint that brought theory out of the academy and into the avant-garde, as well as refocusing the theoretical discussion upon current and key movements of the time. Just to give a few examples, radical psychiatry, Italian autonomia, the terrorism question in the divided Germany of the 70s and 80s, and they also put out volumes from groups such as the Black Panthers in the 90s and the Invisible Committee in the 2000s to the present day. We're also here to discuss Semiotext and its influence in the birth of Zer0 Books, particularly through the editorial style of one of its key founders and editors, Sylvère Lotringer, who sadly passed away in December last year. Joining us in this archaeological escapade is founding Zer0 Books author Owen Hatherley, who helped start off the Zer0 Books catalogue with his text Militant Modernism in 2009, covering everything in social modernist design from Brutalism to Reichian Sexpolitics, and his second publication was Zer0 with 2011's Uncommon, a historical class analysis of the band Pulp through the landscape of post-industrial England. However, Owen joins us in the archives today to discuss his reflections on Lotringer and Semiotext from his article on how they made theory cool in Tribune Magazine, where Owen is the culture editor. Owen, welcome to the Zer0 Books archives.
Thank you.
Also joining me in the archives is Kyle from Zer0's own Profane Illuminations and the Labour Kyle YouTube channel, and Matt, who also joins us from Acid Horizon.
Hello.
Banger of an intro, friend.
I agree.
So, thank you. So let's just start with just who was the late Sylvère Lotringer and sort of what was his political background, such that he and others such as Susie Flatto and John Rachman saw the need for a publisher like Semiotext. You know, where was the theoretical urge to publish in this manner sort of originating from?
I'm not an expert on Lotringer personally, and I suppose what's interesting about him is that he had a background in militancy. He had been a leader of a Zionist Marxist youth movement in his teens and 20s before he became disillusioned to Zionism, and he had always been very much sort of on the far left and didn't seem to have the same sort of nouveau philosophes kind of moment of guilt about it that a lot of his contemporaries did. He didn't seem to decide that, everything led to the Gulag in the same way that a lot of people his age did. I suppose the thing that the sort of various different things in the mix, the kind of American discovery of theory, which is happening kind of parallel to this, and which he has some sort of role in the US, particularly through the fact that he becomes close to and has a relationship with Chris Kraus, as everyone that's read I Love Dick knows very well. And so you have this kind of, sort of post-Warhol New York sort of writing scene is therefore connected to this kind of like French Marxist and post-Marxist theory scene, which is then connected with the no-wave scene, which they also become sort of dabblers in. So you have these three quite sort of disparate things that otherwise wouldn't be particularly closely connected, that Lotringer kind of loops together.
Yeah, and particularly bringing this sort of post-war moment, I mean, it's very tied up with the movements of 68. He starts Semiotext. Well, it starts off in the 70s. Yeah. So
I suppose there's also a kind of there's a sort of prehistory of it, which is generally sort of lightly forgotten as a sort of fairly kind of normal sort of post-Marxist, post-structuralist journal. And no one really reads that stuff. And suddenly it sort of starts, everything sort of starts with these sort of late 70s, early 80s things, like the German issue, the Autonomia issue, these things that are just very, very kind of stark and aggressive and kind of post-punk looking. So, yeah, there's definitely a kind of story before where the story really picks up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things particularly close to myself in Semiotext is the schizo culture stuff, the beginnings and the kind of anti-psychiatry, very much an embracing of the kind of, I wouldn't say pro-mad position of people like Deleuze and Guattari and R.D. Lang and Foucault, but the idea of mad liberation and questioning the dominant sort of very Oedipal structures of Freudian psychoanalysis as it was, particularly in France, with the fact that it was, to get a job in certain corporations, you needed a psychological, psychoanalytical profile, particularly the hold it had in France. I mean, in 1973, the schizo culture event in New York has these quotes as from Deleuze and Guattari and Michel Foucault on power of desire, the power of madness, which of course had an after party to it, and that was very much connected to how Lotringer was very connected in the sort of the no wave scene in New York at the time.
And it's also worth emphasizing that the original schizoculture conference was organized, at least in part, to introduce American audiences to what was going on in France at the time, particularly with Deleuze and Foucault, who were present there and delivering papers at the time. And so Semiotext is both involved in that original and really quite important conference, but also in some of these later texts that were published in these sort of interesting, slightly edgy, smaller volumes, things you could almost sort of fit in your pocket almost, rather than the full tome, for example, of 1,000 Plateaus, which we're perhaps used to now. You would get a sort of slim volume, which was, if I remember correctly, it was the Nomad Plateau, and it would be a shorter one. So the conference itself was influential in sort of bringing them outside of France into the English-speaking world, particularly in America, but also it shows you what Semiotext was doing, the influence it had.
The historicizing that all of you have done is extremely both good and important, because we've mentioned all of the sort of key elements to the beginning of the sort of like estuarial beginning of Semiotext as like a reading group with graduate students, from this very sort of quirky professor who was in many ways looking to try and step out of academia or to continue expanding the schizocultural methodology. And all of this on the backdrop of New York City, which was at the time in the 1970s basically bankrupt. There was a financial crisis that was essentially had ripped its way through that city and created unbelievable levels of inequality and poverty. And this is where the no wave scene itself emerged, and why no wave and Semiotext communicated so well together, not just via this porousness, a deliberate porousness between art and theory that was so remarkable, but also in the grounded in the particularities of their material conditions. Especially, it's worth imagining, for those who aren't familiar with this time in New York City, it's worth imagining a building catching on fire due to any number of things, essentially, poor maintenance, bad landlords and slumlords, et cetera. And then that section of that block remaining just completely destroyed for years and years and years. To try and do well by our topic today, Semiotext, and use an image rather than go on describing it and historicizing in that way, I think that image is representative of the context and the sort of tensions in the structures around them and their responding structural critique. Schizoculture as a sort of methodological starting point, but in the spirit of that sort of methodology, one that is I was quoting Francois Peraldi, an affirmative process in the negative. So it thus takes on forms and contexts that can be surprising in many ways, I think, which is, again, the spirit of the project really sort of matches in its historical context in a beautiful way.
I think we can talk about sort of what sets Semiotext apart, particularly in the Foreign Agent series, through looking at this affect or presenting what really is the constructive consequences of capital, of social order, and where they actually end up. I mean, thinking about the book Simulations by Baudrillard, the one they produced, it's so incredibly expensive now, but it's a tiny little book of Baudrillard, and it looks like what the Terminator sees. It's all of this red, very cybernetic. It looks like the Terminator's heads-up display. And now I'm going to be very Mark Fisher about this, and I'm saying it's essentially a work of jungle, that design. Thinking about Kojo Eshin and Mark Fisher's talking about how jungle is about making anxiety enjoyable, connecting a desire to that anxiety. Because all the early jungle tracks are Terminator, Cylon. It's about being chased by a robot that's banging its head against the wall, and turns out actually you fucking enjoy the anxiety of that upbeatness, that feeling. And I think that is really what sets them apart, presenting that rawness and connecting a theoretical desire to it that makes you really want to engage with that. And I think that very much connects with No Wave as well. I'm just thinking of the early Swans records, where they connected you to this very raw capitalistic form of exploitation in words delivered unto you, and you can sort of engage with it in a way that makes it quite enjoyable. You can enjoy the bleakness of it, and you can sort of move through the roughage of that.
I think it sort of makes them very much part of the 80s and 90s in that regard. Like, although a lot of the stuff they were publishing, especially when they were kind of, filleting Thousand Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus, they might have been sort of filleting a much more optimistic kind of post-68 kind of philosophy. But the way it was always presented was always quite sort of nihilistic and, sort of deliberately obnoxious and bleak. So it happened, and the fact that it sort of happened during the sort of Reagan-Thatcher years is really not coincidental. They're sort of works, I suppose, of people that haven't quite sold out, but also have no hope whatsoever. They're very much, which why sort of, in a way, sort of Baudrillard seems more the kind of quintessential semiotext kind of pocketbook author than Deleuze and Guattari. There's too much optimism in their work.
Yeah, I mean, for Acid Horizon, we've read Communists Like Us by Negri and Guattari, kind of a preface to talking about semiotext in a wider context. And even then, just thinking back to that text, it's too optimistic for the things I think of when I think of a semiotext book. I think of The Agony of Power. I think of The Nomadology, which is a treatise on war. Capital Hates Everyone by Lazzarato, or The Coming Insurrection.
And all of those earlier books. I mean, the big first semiotext book for me would have been nearly 20 years ago. Was Pure War, with the interview book with Virilio and Lotringer. And people have pointed this out in a lot of obituaries, quite rightly. Lotringer was a phenomenal interviewer. Like would bring out, the most kind of, often the most sort of direct and extreme versions of a particular person's philosophy. He'd tease them out beautifully. And that book is amazing, by far the best thing Virilio ever did. But it's absolutely like being whacked over the head. And that kind of, again, in this sort of very sort of Paul Verhoeven, James Cameron kind of way.
Lotringer's interviews, one of them has been put to stage. This is the interview he did with the man who gave electroshock therapy to the famously eccentric, schizophrenic playwright Antonin Artaud. He did an interview with Artaud's electroshock therapist, who is also the man who he had always conversations about God with. And just in interviewing Artaud's doctor, he managed to get this incredible amount of just theological richness, but also really gets you into the meat of this, for lack of a better term, madness, but he wants you to pursue it. I think the interview form is very good in terms of delivering you that theoretical aspect and not necessarily dampen it down for you, not becoming patronizing, so to speak, but ultimately delivering it in a way in which you enjoy the anxieties of getting through something that's that rough and that in many ways technical.
Yeah, absolutely. But I suppose there's a kind of, the way that it's all kind of linked then to fiction. I mean, it's kind of weird that we kind of keep talking about in terms of sort of music and cyberpunk film and so forth. They published nothing on that, whereas they did have this kind of huge sort of fiction side. Which, and let's be absolutely honest here. The people around the sort of early Zer0 book scene that were reading semiotext books were not reading Chris Kraus and Eileen Miles and Cookie Muller and so forth. So the Kati Acker, definitely, but apart from that kind of scene wasn't really what interested any of us, partly probably because of the fact we're about 90% blokes. But it was kind of interesting later to see the kind of the cult of Chris Kraus come from absolutely nowhere, because obviously she's completely crucial to the story and crucial to the fact that, it became this much larger thing than just kind of publishing theory books. But yeah, it's a thing which, in retrospect, seems very much part of it. But at the time, there was, you would go into the secondhand bookshops to look for the semiotext books, and there was often a slight disappointment when you found a fiction one.
I honestly, until researching for this episode, did not know they published fiction. But semiotext is known very much for the tiny little book of insurrection, essentially a little red book for people who aren't quite Marxist, aren't quite anarchist in many senses. I mean, The Coming Insurrection was the first big thing for me, and it definitely sent me on that kind of spiral. And even they were just talking about Baudrillard. The first thing I talked about was the cover. Yes, it is very much an aesthetic kind of theory. And I would like to get into a bit about the early sort of the Zer0 Books blogosphere, particularly sort of the encounter with semiotext, how that may have filtered through stuff like the music press, the fashion press, and how that sort of was formative for that original blogosphere that was coming together in the new way of doing theory, and then eventually founded what Zer0 Books became today.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've sort of made a sort of glancing reference there, and I do think there's a generational difference with respect to how semiotext is remembered. And I guess it's roughly kind of like people over a certain age, I guess, which I'm just about in, remember it for the foreign agents, for these translations of and interviews with theory people. Whereas younger people, it's generally the native Asian stuff. So it is kind of Chris Kraus and Eileen Miles and so forth. Whereas, and it was hard to see sometimes. I'm going to answer the question in a minute. I'm just going to go back to this bit. But this was just kind of wanted to finish off this thought. I suppose it was also hard to work out what the connection was a lot of the time. Again, I think the sort of blokiness of the scene comes out here a little bit. That it was often hard to see the connection between the theory and the writing of a lot of those women. Whereas with Kathy Acker, it was incredibly easy. It was like obvious that you would read Kathy Acker alongside Deleuze and Guattari and Baudrillard and Virilio and so forth. That seemed completely logical. Whereas with a lot of the rest, it was kind of like, oh, how does this fit? So coming to it via the music press, and it was retrospective. It wasn't anyone coming to it through the 2000s music press, and I think this is an obvious point for some, but I think maybe sort of some, might need pointing out for others that that there was a kind of like being interested in culture and pop culture and being interested in them in a political and theoretical way in the early to mid 2000s. Was kind of a little bit like trying to convince people that something that you believed had happened had even happened. Like, it wasn't necessarily like people would kind of go like, well, there used to be, someone would quote Paul Virilio, a melody maker, and that was the thing, but now we're doing something else, which is, I don't know, profiles of landfill indie bands. Not that didn't happen at the time as well. It was a sort of denial that it could ever have happened. There was a sort of really weird, there was a thing called the Observer Music Monthly at the time. And if you really want to get an absolute concentrated blast of how that stuff was at the time, like go and read some of the Observer Music Monthly. And it was just like, it was basically being kind of having shit shoveled in your mouth and told it's wonderful by people like, people who would later become, those endless kind of ex-comedians and ex-music journalists who were such a pain in the ass in the 4 years when I left around the Labour Party, who were constantly telling us how foolish we were. And again, music journalists and comedians were always very, very close within this. The kind of online scene was made up, I think, and I don't think this is an original observation either, was made up of people who remembered an earlier time and then recreated their idea of it on the internet. So it didn't necessarily closely resemble the original because it was being done by people, kind of ad hoc, self-publishing and so forth. And there was generally a kind of a sort of scene around I Love Music and Freaky Trigger, which I guess the theory they read would have been, and I apologize to some of them here, would have been something like Richard Rorty. Then a kind of K-punk aligned, sort of Simon Reynolds aligned blogosphere, where it was much more that kind of semiotext canon. And much more, I guess, people that had been either kind of post-punk damaged or jungle damaged or both. They'd usually kind of come to theory through that. And so, you read something like Energy Flash by Simon Reynolds, and Reynolds is really like absolutely at the heart of all of this. You read something like Energy Flash by Simon Reynolds, and it's like, well, half of it is a straightforward, here is the history of rave culture, in which he fillets various things he wrote for the music press and tells a story like a normal music book would. And the rest of it is, here's how you can understand jungle via Mille Plateau by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. And the integration of those things was really exciting, that you would get the thing of like someone explaining to you why, like, why We Are Back by LFO is a banger at the same time that they're explaining, these complex theoretical ideas. And you could take that in all kinds of directions. You could take that by kind of going into the theory much more deeply. And obviously coercion is a crucial link in all of this. And that in More Brilliant Than the Sun doesn't have that kind of, that half that Energy Flash has of it holding your hand through it. There's no holding your hand throughout the whole of that book. So it just like completely drops you in all of this. And I guess the interesting thing, there's a line in the interview at the end, which I believe is an interview between Kojo and Mark. At least that's what I remember being told. This was before anyone knew who Mark was, really. there's a line in there about something like, you don't need to like apply philosophy or theory to this stuff because it's already theoretical. You don't like it's like grotesque to like apply Heidegger to George Clinton as the example he gives, which I believe comes from Simon Critchley, who was a big kind of hate figure of a lot of these people. I've never read any Critchley, so I have no idea why he was such a hate figure, but he was. You know, that George Clinton is already theory for Kojo and Mark. It was already theory. So you put it alongside those things. You didn't do that kind of dreadful kind of pop philosophy kind of thing. You know, there's shelves of books in university bookshops where it's like, how reading Derrida will help you understand the OC or whatever.
The philosophy of Rick and Morty.
Yeah, like, and that there's shitloads of that, and we despise that as much as anything else. But I mean, I'm quite a bit younger than those people, so I came to it even more retrospectively. Like, you know, like the music press, when I first encountered it, was in the Britpop era. And Simon Reynolds was still writing, and there were other interesting writers around. But it was kind of the death throes of that. So it was really deeply retrospective. And it was, you know, to use a very kind of blog metaphor, it was like kind of like finding
Semiotext is already, and its legacy within the music press and that the blogosphere scene is already a hauntology. We have to say the word.
It already was. It already was. But that's the thing, like, it was all, you know, even before, like, you know, things started happening, it was already enormously driven by loss. And I don't really think, would people have been reading semiotext books from the time, even? Because obviously when things kind of start to hot up a bit politically with the financial crisis, you get the Invisible Committee stuff. I don't think any of us read the Invisible Committee. I think we thought it was silly. It was quite funny at getting onto Glenn Beck. Like that would have been interesting. But the actual kind of like direction that they went in theory, the sort of particular kind of ultra left version, the path that they took, I guess wasn't quite so interesting. You know, there are definitely later texts which I think we were interested in, but all that sort of stuff like the coming insurrection, the theory of the young girl, and all of that.
I mean, just to go back just quickly to your point about the theory already being the music, just to anyone listening who's available to get to London soon, one of the best examples of this is there's now a exhibition of Kojo Eshin and Drexciya, the techno act Drexciya. So Kojo's the group, the Otterlift group, has a movie playing about Drexciya, the Detroit techno band, next to one of his reviews, Fear of a Wet Planet, and then you've got the Drexciya comic book and a Drexciya CD in this glass case. It's essentially a techno hyperstition exhibition going in the middle of the Tate Modern, and if anyone can get there, it's absolutely fantastic, and it really sort of shows where it's at with this. And I think you do talk about in the Tribune articles sort of the parts where it seemed like a bit of a dead end when it came to semiotext. I mean, not to say it's all dead end but in the sort of the direction it took, presenting a very, I guess, I mean, Matt, we've talked about this before coming on, that it is a hyper-masculine kind of violence that really just wants to get back to the barricades and act as if, you know, as it was writing, that people were already at the barricades in France. And there is that kind of an aggression to semiotext. It definitely didn't filter into that scene. I mean, none of the early Zero texts particularly had much to do with the idea of sabotaging stuff or forming ZADs, independent communes, and the like.
Well, I think there's various things going on there, and I think one of them is that we were all wimps. Like, you know, there was no one that you know that worked out or was particularly, you know, physically what's the word, imposing. So there's that. I think also, you can probably see there was something that was going on also that I guess had nothing to do with the semiotext whatsoever, but was also very, very retrospective, which is the H word.
Hauntology.
And so I think for us, very broadly conceived, you'd approach a semiotext book, a little semiotext book, in the same way that you would like an old Penguin or Pelican book. And you would see, I have no idea what would have happened if you put Tony Godwin, who was the main kind of Penguin Books editor in its golden years, and Lotringer in a room together. Like, whether it had got on, I don't know. But they were both these things of like, you would take these difficult and weird ideas and put them in a cheap paperback book that you could fit in your pocket. And so I guess that you would sort of have this kind of congeries of things that didn't make any any sense at all being put together, and which we didn't theorize that and just ignored it completely. I remember Simon Reynolds making a bitchy comment along the lines of, like, when we got really into like old calves, got really into like greasy spoon calves, and like going to old, particularly Italian cafes in London. And he was like, I never thought I'd see the day that the Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit would be like, devoting themselves to like glories of like, the proper full English breakfast. They were all about trying to find things that weren't the Observer Music Monthly, that weren't the London 2012 Olympic ceremony, that weren't BBC Three and BBC Four. There weren't this awful middlebrow moron culture of that period, kind of populist without actually being popular, as Mark always called it. And so, on the one hand, you'd sort of draw on this kind of like either nihilistic or ultra left tradition that Semiotext very amply represented, or it's sort of post 68 thought, autonomia, this kind of insurgent, romantic kind of anti-state tradition. And at the same time, which had already been linked in the 90s by the CCRU and by Simon Reynolds and by Kojo Eshin to jungle and to particular kinds of music. So that was happening on the one hand. But you also had this kind of nostalgia for this earlier public culture of the BBC, Pelican Books, Open University, blah, 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 blah. And those two, and that was seen as something that was linked to official institutions, to a sort of quasi-benevolent state, to a certain vision of left-wing social democracy. And that is a thing which obviously kind of Semiotext would have had no interest in whatsoever. It's very notable if you look, and I in preparation for this, I was looking at like a recent, one of those kind of, there's a bookshop by Goldsmiths College that has one of those kind of stands with cheap paperbacks. They still have a load of new Semiotext books in there, posted Lazzarato and people like that. And I was kind of like, just looking at them and being like, it's really notable that the kind of, I guess, the thing that happened in the left in the last 10 years, and particularly in the last 6, which was a movement towards having a go at utilizing the existing institutions of representative democracy, of kind of trying to do a kind of left social democracy. And, that happened in the US, and it happened in the UK, and it's happened in Spain, and it happened in Greece. And that movement, you could see no trace of whatsoever in anything Semiotext have done. And maybe that's because it's really boring. That's not really a criticism of Semiotext. I can imagine it bores their asses off. Like, you're trying social democracy again? Wasn't it bad enough the first time? I can kind of imagine why they'd be like bored with it. But that's where I think most of the kind of blog people and most of the kind of energy behind that kind of flowed in that direction. And of course, that's led to sort of wonderful and interesting things, such as the current president of Chile being like a K-punk fan. This is the world we live in now. It's wonderful in some ways. But also it meant that, I guess, the more kind of edgelord side of it completely sort of disappeared. And there was an edgelord side to it. And there was also a quite right-wing side to it, if you read it in a certain way. And there are people who I'm not going to name, but you can work it out yourselves, who were very deeply involved early on in Zer0, who have gone in that kind of edgelord alt-right direction. And in a way, that's as legitimate or illegitimate a kind of path out from that as is social democracy.
It reminds me a little bit of how you discuss Adam Curtis in your one of your latest book, Clean Living Under Difficult Circumstances. Particularly, we talk about how Adam Curtis starts off in like a bit like the early Zer0 in a way, but then as he gets a bit more jaded and a bit more discontent with his readership, he ends up enjoying, in a sense, saying how much everything has collapsed, and then you end up going into sort of going to Nick Land territory. But no, sorry, I'll let Kyle and Matt.
I want to jump in there if I can, because I wanted to ask you, Owen, about this. Because on the one hand, if we look at sort of Fisher's work, Simon Reynolds, this kind of, as you said, it's not the application of theory to music. It's more like a kind of merging of the two, this sort of critical analysis of popular culture, something like that. On the one hand, we have that. And on the other hand, we have their more openly political engagement, again, with these kind of early semiotext works, whether it's Foucault or Deleuze, etc., Baudrillard and all the rest. It seems like both of those have fallen away. On the one hand, it's possible that I've simply not found the right places to get this kind of musical criticism, for example. But I've not seen that in years and years and years and years. You certainly don't find it, as you put it in The Guardian. So I was wondering, like, on the one hand, with the music or culture, where did that go? And maybe we'll do that first. I want to ask you about sort of British left-wing politics a little bit after that as well.
So, yeah, I'll take the music one first. So one of the people that I think has always been a kind of interlocutor for this stuff, but who's never actually written any of it down, it's just that he has ideas and we ripped them off, is Ninja Bhattacharya, who is all over Energy Flash. And like his ideas are like, you know, I'm not saying that Simon ripped him off, he's credited throughout, but like, and he was also a very big influence on the blog scene. He was commissioning us all because he was working at the time as a socialist worker, of all places. And he basically had a line on this and a line on like the H word that I guess it sort of made sense because we were all coming to terms with the fact that a certain paradigm had disappeared or was disappearing. And you could do that in the kind of burial way by like kind of lamenting the very recent past, but by lamenting the 90s in his case. Or you could go back and do the kind of, you know, sort of imaginary Pelican Books radiophonic workshop world that people were doing at the same time. But they were all based on this, on really kind of coming to terms with mourning, if you like, the fact that the constant churn had ceased. And it had ceased. And at the time, there were a lot of people, some of whom I very much respect, who were very much denying that the churn had ceased or was ceasing. And it was bollocks. It was total fucking bollocks. Like, obviously it was happening. You know, it was patently obvious in the mid-2000s that pop cultural acceleration had slowed to a crawl. And that isn't the same as saying that, like, popular culture in general had slowed to a crawl, because it hadn't. You know, all sorts of other things were kind of proliferating. And there's obviously a very distinct youth culture. When I look, you know, people 15 or 20 years younger than me, it's obviously that there's a youth culture there, but it's not the same thing. It's not based on this kind of constant musical innovation and so forth. And so for the last 10 years, there's not really been... So I guess the kind of 90s CCRU thing was celebrating the churn that was still then happening. And then the kind of mid-2000s theory, some of which was those same people, and some of which was people that were 10 or 15 years younger than me, than like me, were kind of going like, hang on, this is grinding to a halt. What does that mean? What do we do now? And then what happened after that, at least according to Bat's analysis of this, is that then it just ground to a halt and we just accepted it. And that's what we have now. And there are, you know, there'll be interesting records in the same way there are interesting realist novels. You know, fine. It's not like saying there'll be no good music ever again. You know, that's not really it. It's like saying that a particular paradigm, particular kind of renaissance, if you like, took place and ended. And actually, a lot of Zer0 books, one of the most interesting early Zer0 books was one that really tried to just to resist that, which is Infinite Music by Adam Harper. That's a fascinating book, but and it beautifully describes the music that it celebrates from the kind of early 2010s. But the argument, the implicit argument throughout that because of this, you know, that kind of motor of pop culture innovation hasn't ceased was obviously untrue. And, you know, here we are 10 years later, and we know that, like, you know, wonky was not actually something as important as jungle or two-step or post-punk or hip-hop. Like, obviously it fucking wasn't. And even at the time that was obvious. But, you know, there's some fun tunes. I think that's kind of what happened there. So there is probably quite a lot of interesting music writing happening, but it would be totally disconnected from that way of understanding it, which is why, like, certainly as a commissioning editor, as an editor at Tribune, and I do a little bit also at Jacobin, it can be quite hard to find kind of music writers, because I think there's a sort of mutual incomprehension a lot of the time between kind of what I would be looking for and what they would be doing. And I kind of want to move away from that, but I don't really... I think a lot of it is the kind of current enormously, you know, the current kind of celebration of positionality rather than sonics. And I don't care. You know, you used to be able to have positionality and sonics. You know, and when it's just basically being asked to kind of celebrate someone because of who and what they are, that's interesting. It's interesting, fine, but I'm not going to listen to the records. There's like 40 years of amazing music of which I've not listened to all of it, and I could listen to it for my whole life, and I wouldn't be able to listen to every good jazz record and every good techno record and so forth. Like, you know, but why would I bother listening to this 10th rate stuff? So that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, that does. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess I also want to ask, apologies to Kyle, there's 3 bits of a podcast, so we're going to be a little bit biased on this one. So I wanted to ask about British left, particularly with the reception of semiotext, and I guess call it primarily French, but also Italian theory through them, because it seems to me from abroad that there has been, or was at least, a quite significant take-up of that over in the United States. But it just strikes me right now, because for my sins, I've been a member of the Labour Party for a few years, and I haven't quite left yet.
No, me neither.
Teetering on the edge.
Similarly.
Teetering on the edge. But it strikes me that that's not part of the conversation there. You wouldn't expect an analysis of the Labour Party to include the sort of references that Mark Fisher, for example, might have pointed to in understanding certain new tendencies under capital, etc. It just seems like there's something missing there about perhaps semiotext, but also quote-unquote theory in general, particularly within Labour, which is, love it or hate it, still primarily the home of the left in Britain.
In 2000 and, the time we're sort of dealing with, I guess, which sort of roughly, let's say, 2004 to 11, no one involved in any of this would have been a member of the Labour Party or seen the slightest hope within it whatsoever. The first person I met who was kind of connected to that scene and interested in it, who later became obviously very crucial to Zer0 and to Repeater, who was actually a member, is Alex Niven, who is a few years younger than me. And I think that was that was kind of based on taking the logic of the position I think that we'd kind of boxed ourselves into, which is that, we're all going to hell, but perhaps social democracy can save us. I remember Ben Noyes describing this, and I'm not quite sure if it was an insult or not, as Keynesianism as a catechon, which is an extremely Ben Noyes formulation. I'm very, very fond of it. And that's, I think, that we all kind of flooded into that direction and kind of took particular kind of theoretical kind of peccadillos along with it. But that it was all contingent on a particular project at a particular time rather than Labour Party per se. So I guess it is reverting to type in every possible respect. The sort of very, very kind of sort of dull-witted, thuggish kind of institution that we knew and loved when it was in government is very much back. And, the days in which John McDonnell would sit around and talk about Polansas are gone. It's kind of interesting to kind of think about what theory then, I suppose the first point is what theory kind of went into the kind of 2015 to 1920, or go to 20 in the US, kind of attempt at doing democratic socialism. Because it was an odd box of tricks. Obviously there was the sort of Falk element to it, which is connected to this through the common interest in autonomia. So, someone like Bastani and the kind of people involved in Navarra, they would certainly have been readers of those blogs, and they will have been readers of that particular end of the semiotext canon. So of Deleuze and Guattari, Negri, later on, Bifo, Virno, etc. Yeah, exactly. There was that incredible Bifo, Ash Sarkar, TV thing, which was mind-boggling. That was hegemony for 5 seconds. So there's that. So the kind of nihilistic end of it kind of gets jettisoned because we're going to do a thing.
Right. There's an opportunity here, perhaps. Yeah.
So that kind of everyone stops reading Baudrillard, which is a shame in a way because it would have told us what was going to happen, which is that we would be totally fucking crushed by the media, and in an absolutely hallucinatory way as well. And a paradoxical way, in a very kind of bizarre way. So that happened. But then there was another thing that was happening where I think slightly younger, actually, not all younger, but there were people that started their blogs later, who were later kind of people in Zer0. So Alex Niven, Reichian Jones, Carl Neville, who's actually about 15 years older than me. They, I think, had a more kind of, particularly Reichian and Alex, had a more sort of straight up English Marxist and Welsh Marxist, obviously in Reichian's case, way of looking at theory. And certain kind of people that we kind of basically ignored started to become kind of people that were mentioned. So Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall especially just became absolute touchstones at that point. When actually, if you look at the kind of blogs and the kind of, in the 2000s, neither of them were ever mentioned. I think because they were considered unhip. The thing that I always come back to on this is like the fact that like Bifo gets fucking credit for the slow cancellation of the future. And he actually stole it from Raymond Williams. So Mark is famous for like coining this phrase, which he actually attributes to Bifo, which Bifo has actually lifted lock, stock and barrel from Border Country by Raymond Williams without acknowledging it. And that sums up the whole thing. It was like, wow, there's this really cool Italian thing. They did riots, they did proletarian shopping, they did a bit of terrorism, but not really. They were amazing. They were into value theory, they were mad and interesting and wrote crazy texts. And actually, like, the good idea in that and hauntology, the hauntology stuff that Mark runs with massively, is actually taken from a novel about working class Oxford student going back to see his dad in fucking Abergavenny.
It's incredibly remarkable, the resonance far beyond, I think, just the sort of the Gramscian turn that people are more familiar with in the end of the 60s when Gramsci came into English. I think is this remarkable British Marxist tradition, if you will, with that's too strong of a word, but the continuities that stuck around were, how do we talk about things that are ordinary and redeem and reclaim these ordinary things, if sometimes in bleak ways, in the case of like a no-wave music scene, or what has now become ordinary and accepted and sort of guaranteed by virtue of cultural discourse or sort of larger movements around power. And I think there is, perhaps than some would, willingly admit, me probably in certain times of my studies or in life or whatever, is that there's a unification at the point of, I think about Foucault's relatively famous tirade at the Schizoculture conference, where he said, "C'est la fin," it's the end of the 1960s. And so much of what is coloring all of the really, like, people are really going to geek out on all of the blog life conversation that we've been having here, thanks to Owen. And I think the continuity that appears in these sort of various forms of thought is, what do you do at the end of something? In the case of the Communist Party's historians group, what do you do when you're in opposition to Stalinism and the break that came with Hungary and that sort of a thing?
There's that. And also just like, the Communist Party historians group, the fact that it's a historians group in Britain and nowhere else that becomes so important, I think is partly, traditions of empiricism and so forth, but it's also just like, it was a tiny crap Communist Party.
Yeah.
So there was a real, like, how do we explain the fact that no one likes us?
Yeah.
Okay, just to round things off, I'm going to finish with the statement that was actually on the back of the original Zer0 Books group. This hasn't actually been heard for quite a long time, and I think through this we can summarize the links between Semiotext and the publishing ethos and what became Zer0 Books, which you all know and love, and are coming back to remember today as we progress into the future. So here we go. Here's the statement. Contemporary culture has eliminated both the concept of the public and the figure of the intellectual. Former public spaces, both physical and cultural, are now either derelict or colonized by advertising. A cretinous anti-intellectualism presides, cheer-led by expensively educated hacks in the pay of multinational corporations who reassure their bored readers that there is no need to rouse themselves from their interpassive stupor. The informal censorship, internalized and propagated by the cultural workers of late capitalism, generates a banal conformity that the propaganda chiefs of Stalinism could only ever have dreamt of imposing. Zer0 Books knows that another kind of discourse, intellectual without being academic, popular without being populist, is not only possible, it is already flourishing in the regions beyond the strip-lit malls of so-called mass media and the neurotically bureaucratic calls of the academy. Zer0 is committed to the idea of publishing as a making public of the intellectual. It is convinced that in the unthinking, blandly consensual culture in which we live, critical and engaged theoretical reflection is more important than ever before. And just to give a little bit of a final thought on this myself, This is what Lotringer was talking about. Don't give people what they want, they'll hate you for it. We can treat our readers like adults and have fun at the same time. It's what Fisher was talking about with the cheeseburger. You know, people want Nietzsche in the same way they want a cheeseburger, but actually the enjoyment of that roughness, that indigestibility is Nietzsche. I think this is a way of communicating people at their own level, but in a way which definitely tries to push that boundary forward in terms of getting the theoretical communication, the way that it's also not only a self-education, but an encounter that broadens the imaginations of political thought. Just want to turn to my guests and co-hosts here for final thoughts.
It's remarkable to think about sort of legacy in media and be able to have conversations about the things that we have today and in previous times. As someone who's been an educator in various contexts, as well as someone who's engaged with these types of work, I find it significant and important the way that Semiotext and what Zer0 Books and Repeater Books are doing is attempting to resist the sort of like inward black hole that we're constantly struggling against. And we're constantly struggling at the end of whatever came before us, and it's becoming difficult to imagine what comes next. Semiotext and the blog culture that we were talking about and more contemporary iterations of these are willing to create a new language to describe the way that we talk about things. They're willing to sort of give body to the presence and the changes in our world in a way that sort of make things feel very real, and that the future is being written rather than forecasted for ordinary people. And the fact that this can be linked from culture all the way to very affecting writing and intense and difficult writing is almost poetic in its web-like construction, this horizontal, interconnected object that we don't know where one point starts and the other ends. And I've always found that very motivating and beautiful.
I don't know if I have anything particularly profound to add, so I'll let Owen have the last word on sort of Semiotext and Zer0. But I think I came into this a little bit later, of course, Semiotext. When I think about most of the books that over the last 5-6 years for me have really sort of changed my worldview, a lot of them are Semiotext. That's probably a lot of more recent ones, but also a lot of the work by Deleuze and Guattari for me personally. I think the legacy of Semiotext in bringing quite radical theoretical ideas to a broader audience than simply, you know, academics and students studying philosophy and so on. There's a long sort of legacy there. It's had a huge impact, not only in America, where that sort of early sort of schizoculture conference was held by the, you know, people involved in Semiotext, but also in the UK, blogosphere, music criticism, and also elements of more recent political movements in the UK, I think. Momentum, there was some political education coming through there at the time, which are more indebted to this. So it's got a long legacy, and I think we can be quite thankful for not only Lotringer, but also the other people involved in that, for what they did in bringing these ideas to a wider audience than these ideas are normally, you know, consumed by, I suppose. There's just rarefied academic institutions, but, you know, they're quite exclusionary. And these amazing little, sometimes pocket-sized books, other times accessible but quite lengthy tomes, they can make a big impact. Yeah, I think I'm quite grateful for it, and also the influence on Zer0 Books in the early stages, and Fisher and other people. We can be grateful for Semiotext in a way.
I suppose when I kind of wrote a thing about Lotringer for Tribune after he died, I remember someone, before I deleted my Twitter, saying something along the lines of, "Oh, so you know, you're suggesting that, like, you know, millions of people were reading like Semiotext books." Like, no, obviously not. And I suppose what's interesting for me, I think everybody, and there was a lot of subtweeting going on in that piece, and I suppose I could be slightly clearer about what I meant. And it was a little bit aimed at sort of Mark II Zer0 books, but actually not really. Or at least they were kind of an epiphenomenon of what I'm talking about, rather than the thing itself. A lot of people have decided that the reason why we lost is because we're weird. And I think that's actually fairly shallow. I mean, maybe there's an element of it, perhaps. But the left has always been weird. The left was weird, you know, when it had like millions of adherents, and it was weird in the 90s when it had about 10 adherents. Like, it's a constant. This kind of like we're too weird thing leads to this kind of idea that, and we need to be more normal, or at least a particular model of communication whereby you give people the facts, you give them the kind of meat and the potatoes, and they consume this nourishing fare, and then they become socialists. I don't think that's ever really been true. I think there's obviously that it's useful to do things like, and late in late life, Mark Fisher was very much a big defender of Owen Jones's work, which is exactly that. It is the meat and potatoes of the left, and very good meat and potatoes they are. But there's more than one way to kind of connect with people, and there's more than one way to communicate with people, and that won't do to kind of have, on the one hand, there's straightforward tub-thumping socialist discourse. And on the other, there is art wankers and academic wankers. And what is interesting, I suppose, about semiotext and the way in which they approach trying to kind of disseminate their thing is the way that they just very much tried to be, eventually basically they kind of did. They were quite art wanker adjacent, certainly. They kind of had a way of communicating that completely circumvented that. So that's why you would get semiotext books being cited in like music papers that were read by hundreds of thousands of people. It's because they were able to kind of circumvent that thing via the presentation, but also via the way that they filleted those books and would condense them and would rely so much on interviews. So they did change the content. You didn't get, I wouldn't say it was a cheeseburger, but it wasn't the full meal, as it were. It was the kind of Haribo of the of the theory world. But I don't know, this is a stupid metaphor, but I think that's what we were sort of trying to do, and it comes through very strongly in that early Zero statement, is that we were very much not kind of telling people, "Hi, we're just like you," and why not become aware of the inbuilt iniquities of capitalism, because I think people see that and they smell it, and they can smell its bullshit, particularly when it's coming from people that aren't. That currently there's just this huge phenomenon of like Marxist intellectuals ashamed of the fact that they're Marxist intellectuals and desperately wishing that they were like Eugene V. Debs. And just like you can be that thing and communicate with people. I think it's possible to do both. And the most interesting people do both. And I suppose semiotext, actually the things in them that now look quite dated, the kind of nihilism and the kind of cyberpunk presentation and the kind of Terminator-ness, I guess, are actually exactly the things that allowed them to make that connection. The person that was reading the music press in 1982 would see it, or the person that was into cyberculture in the early 90s or whatever, who would not necessarily be an academic at all, would see that affinity. And that's what's so interesting. I don't really know how one replicates it or how one sort of tries it again, but I think that's a fun and interesting thing to try and do.
It's always good to come back to the rallying cries of the coming insurrection after an electoral defeat. It's like a good pillow, or it's like a Haribo, and as Haribos are chewy, and as Nietzsche said, with great thoughts we need to chew on them. We must ruminate upon them like the cows in the field. Anyway, let's wrap up. Everyone, go and read Owen's new book, Clean Living Under Difficult Circumstances. Go read Red Metropolis, Socialism and the Government of London. Go check out his old books on Zero. Go read Tribune. One sort of more niche thing I quite liked, one of the things Owen edited, which was the Open House Alternative Guide to the London Boroughs, it got me through the early days of lockdown, being stuck in Zone 6 and pining for the travel across the city. So there's a whole wealth of stuff out there. Owen, thank you so much for coming onto the Zer0 Books archives, and
thank you.
Cheers everyone for listening.